Okay, so is Palestine a state? If you follow global politics, you've probably come across dozens of videos, articles, podcasts that address this question. And most likely, the story goes something like this. The Montevideo Convention of 1933 defines a state as an entity that possesses a permanent population, a defined territory, and a government capable of entering in foreign relations with other states. Since Palestine lacks clear borders and a government capable of engaging with the world, it simply cannot be a state. Now, if you dig a little deeper, you may come across a different justification. That, quote, Palestine is not a state because it has never been a state. In fact, you may have come across a meme that goes back in history to try to show how there always was something other than a Palestinian state in Palestine, culminating with the state of Israel today. In this rationale, the territory of Palestine was not meant for its people, the Palestinians, but instead promised to the leaders of the Zionist movement to become the national home of Jewish people. Thus, when Britain defeated the Ottoman Empire in World War I and gained control over parts of its territory through the creation of various mandates, the Mandate of Palestine was simply the manifestation of this promise, meant for Jews and only for Jews. So, when Israel declared independence in 1948, it allegedly fulfilled this promise, turning Palestine into Israel. The remaining Palestinian territory, not yet under Israeli sovereignty, is simply that, a territory, not a state, to which Israel lays claim. This latter claim recently gained increased legitimacy as it was adopted by Judge Julia Sebutinde in her dissenting opinion in the ICJ's advisory opinion of 19 July 2024 on the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So, is that it? Or is there something off about declaring that a state recognized by 148 other states with almost full membership in the United Nations and full membership in several international organizations, including the International Criminal Court, is simply not a state? Well, let's see, shall we? Now, let me start with a disclaimer. What I'm about to explain to you is my view. It's not a particularly mainstream view in canonical or global north international legal circles. It's the result of applying critical and post-colonial methodologies to the study of international law, which I studied in the global south. You won't see this reasoning in many international law textbooks, but if I'm honest, it's the only way in which I can understand and apply international law consistently without incurring in some pretty jarring internal contradictions. I'll explain as I go along. Just place what I'm about to say in its proper methodological context as part of a project to reclaim international law for the Global South and away from the colonial structures that gave birth to it. We can talk more about that in a later video. So let's start with the beginning. What is a state? It may seem natural at this point in history to conceive the world in neatly drawn lines and maps, each grouping one particular nation. France for the French, Germany for the Germans, England for the English, etc. But the historical reality is very different. For most of human history, maps, sucked, and distances were absurdly vast for people moving at the speed of a wagon. For most of France's history, people's connection to the land was at best local, maybe regional. People spoke regional languages, they didn't speak French, they lived their lives around the courthouse rather than a Parisian bureaucracy. France was very much not for the French, but for the French king. It is only much later, around the mid-1800s, that the idea of, quote, nationalism started to take shape. That each state had to correspond with a nation to form a nation-state. I discussed this development from the perspective of post-colonial theory in a previous video, if you want to know more. Creating nation-states was a product of both technological advancement, distances becoming smaller, and ideology. Mainly, the idea that the world could be fully understood and regulated by sheer human wit. Nature would be taxonomized, the rules of economics would be tamed, political life would be systematized through the science of law. What is a contract? What is marriage? What is a tax? And of course, what is a state? Were all questions we could now define in the abstract language of law. Things could no longer just be. They now needed a stamp, formalities, to meet requirements in a specific piece of paper. It is from this way of thinking that the idea of a state as territory plus population plus government plus capacity to engage in foreign relations comes from. But think about it. This makes little sense. We can't really apply this definition consistently. Is Vatican City a state? Let's see, does it have a permanent population? No. Its inhabitants are cardinals temporarily appointed by the Pope, and nobody is actually born in the Vatican. So that's it. Vatican City does not meet the requirements and so is not a state. But this is unquestionably the wrong answer. Vatican City is a state. How about Somaliland? Not Somalia, Somaliland, a secessionist province in the north. Is it a state? Well, let's see. It has a permanent population, claims a defined territory, and has an autonomous government that is capable of engaging with other states, even if basically no other state, save for Ethiopia, wants to engage with them. So it's a state, right? Well, legally, yes, But in practice, it is unable to exercise most of the rights one commonly associates with a state. So yeah, maybe it isn't a state. Something is definitely off with this definition, but what? Well, I think it's arrogance. In one way or another, states have existed for centuries, if not millennia. They are the product of long, complicated histories of compromises, of asterisks, exceptions, understandings. Trying to reduce this massive complexity into 4 little requirements seems impractical, if not impossible. But okay, the definition is impractical. What about Palestine? Does it or does it not meet it? Well, let's see. Does Palestine have a permanent population? Yes, the Palestinian people. Does it have a defined territory? Yeah, you can see it in the map. The borders are at least as defined as the borders of Israel and Egypt, since they claim defined borders and they border Palestine. Does it have a government? Yes, again, the government of Mahmoud Abbas. And does that government have a capacity to engage with other states? Yes, it's recognized by almost 150 other states. So yeah, even under this very flawed definition, Palestine is a state. But because, as I said, states are not simple, this exercise can be further complicated to create doubt. Does Palestine have a permanent population? Well, no, some argue. It's a population of refugees. Does Palestine have a defined territory? Well, no, again, they'd argue, because Palestine is the product of the mandate systems, of the collapse of the mandate system and the Six-Day War. Its borders are marked by a provisional ceasefire, and so they don't have defined borders. Do they have a government? Well, no, they continue to argue, because the government is really the Palestinian Authority, created through the Oslo Accords, and not a real government. Now, I can spend a long time engaging in protracted legal debates about each and every one of these arguments and show you why I think they are wrong. But honestly, that would be pointless. Again, relying on this definition as if it was the alpha and omega of state creation is, in my opinion, counterproductive. Legalistic arguments alone won't save us. So to fully answer the question of Palestinian statehood, let's look at the other ingredients of state creation: history and politics. Let's go back in time a bit. When would you say that the state of Palestine was created? Most would answer this question with 1988, the year of the Palestinian Declaration of Independence. This makes sense, but let's take a closer look at this claim from the moment when it all began. Opponents of Palestinian statehood argued that it is not a state because at best, all it ever was a mandate. So what is a mandate? After World War I, the territory of the Ottoman Empire was divided into smaller areas of influence that were to be assigned to France and Britain. These mandates were a peculiar creation. They were not colonies because its residents did not have the same citizenship as the mandatory, which did not hold sovereign control over the land. But they were also not fully independent sovereign states. Their rights were subjected to different levels of intervention from the mandatory, Britain in the case of Palestine. The Covenant of the League of Nations defined the Ottoman mandates as follows, quote, "Certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand alone. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory." In other words, in 1919, the international community recognized the Palestinian people as an independent nation that was simply not yet ready to have a full independent state on top of it to create the nation state of the Palestinian people. But then, what exactly was a mandate? This was a question that haunted legal scholars throughout the 1920s. After all, these mandates had been sovereign territory of the Ottoman Empire. So what happened to this sovereignty when Ottoman authority dissolved? It could not have passed to the mandatory, to the UK, because the mandate was not a British colony. The Palestinian people were an independent nation, not British subjects. It could not have reverted to the League of Nations. The League itself did not hold it. It had no claim or authority over what the mandate did. This was such a complicated conundrum for early 20th century legal minds that one author went as far as to claim Ottoman sovereignty was in a state of, quote, abeyance. It was there, but suspended in thin air until someone decided to turn it back on. But what stunned the 20th century mind should be an easy fix for the 21st one, at least in theory. You see, there was one option that these white Western scholars never even considered. The Ottoman sovereignty simply reverted to those who originally held it, the people of Palestine. For them, this was unthinkable. The whole point of colonialism was the idea that non-white, non-Western sovereignty was an impossibility without Western permission. Thankfully, 21st century legal minds do not have a problem with the idea of non-white popular sovereignty, or at least they shouldn't. As John quickly shows in his book, The Statehood of Palestine, mandates granted their own citizenship and passports to their inhabitants, appeared in court, assumed their own debt. If it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck, then maybe it's a duck. A mandate is a state, but not any kind of state. a non-independent state whose sovereignty is subject to the administration of a mandatory. This isn't even very revolutionary. International law recognizes the concept of a protectorate, where a protected state yields its sovereignty in favor of a protector. Peru, my country, was in fact born as a protectorate, subject to the protection of the Argentinian army that declared its independence from Spain. This is not new. In fact, if one sees mandates in their own context as opposed to always in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, mandate statehood becomes even clearer. The mandate of Iraq had a king, Faisal I. In fact, the king was placed in control of Iraq by the British through the signing of a treaty that specifically recognized Iraqi sovereignty. Similarly, the constitutions of the mandates of Syria and Lebanon recognize them as states. So why would Palestine be any different? The mandate of Palestine was the non-independent state of the independent nation of Palestine. Seen from this historical context, the Declaration of Independence takes up a different form. It is Palestine's historic compromise, its announcement that it was willing to accept pre-1967 borders with Israel, not that they became a state. But what about Israel? Is there not an Israel-shaped hole in my argument? Well, let's see. As the theory goes, the Balfour Declaration promised the land of Palestine would become the Jewish national home. And so in 1947, the UN decided to partition Palestine. The Jewish community said yes, the Arab ones said no, and that is that. Israel was born as the sole inheritor of the Palestinian mandate with an Uti Possidetis right, more on this later, to its whole pre-independence territory. If the Arabs wanted a piece of this land, then they should have said yes, right? Well, let's examine this claim. First of all, surprising as it may be, let me start with a fact. Israel was not created as a result of the UN Partition Plan. That Israel is the product of the Partition Plan is such a widespread account that I actually once got trolled by a certain former spokesperson for Israel for saying so, but the truth is it was not. The Partition Plan had certain rules attached to it, the customs union, a cool-off period, the internationalization of Jerusalem, and of course, different borders. While Israel may have referenced the plan in its Declaration of Independence, it certainly, obviously, did not abide by it or implemented it. If Israel's existence were to depend on the validity of the Partition Plan, then Israel's current internationally recognized borders would be an illegal annexation. Israel would need to return to the Partition Plan borders and relinquish its pre-1967 borders. Obviously, this is not Israel's position, or most of the world's for that matter. In fact, as of the 1988 Declaration of Independence and its historic compromise, this is also Palestine's position. It is willing to yield its claim to all of historic Palestine in exchange for peace. So if not the Partition Plan, what is the legal basis for Israel's existence? As I mentioned earlier, Judge Sebutinde argues that it is Uti Possidetis. Uti Possidetis is a concept born out of the wars of Latin American independence. It holds that colonial borders survive decolonization and become international borders. So the borders of the Viceroyalty of Peru, for example, will become the borders of the Republic of Peru. So Sebutinde claims Israel is the mandate of Palestine, now independent. Its colonial borders, i.e. all of historic Palestine, are now Israel's borders, including, of course, the West Bank and Gaza. But there is a problem with this view as well. Israel was not, almost by definition, a Palestinian independentist movement. The Jewish Agency for Palestine, the representative of Zionist interest in Palestine, did not declare independence for Palestine. That was the whole problem that led to the war with the Arab states. Israel was always meant as a country for Jews. The rest of the population was blatantly cleansed from the land during the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. Instead, the agency created Israel in Palestine, not out of Palestine. There simply was never a colonial border to uphold post-independence for this new Jewish state. It was literally brand new. So if not the Partition Plan and not Uti Possidetis, then what? What is the legal basis for Israel's existence? James Crawford, one of the sharpest international legal minds ever to exist and the leading expert on state creation in the early 2000s, had a different view. Israel, he claimed, was the product of secession. It is a portion of the mandate of Palestine that seceded from Palestine. This makes sense. Under the rules of secession, the seceding entity, Israel in this case, can only lay claim to whatever areas it controlled at the end of the War of Secession. In other words, the pre-1967 borders. This way, the discrepancy with the Partition Plan borders would not amount to an illegal annexation. This way as well, Israel does not get to claim the West Bank and Gaza, and instead it would be for Palestine to decide whether it is willing to agree to its historic compromise and yield claim to all of its historic territory. This, I think, is the only way international law can make sense of Israel-Palestine. And mind you, these are not the words of a card-carrying pro-Palestinian radical. Crawford famously died without ever recognizing that Palestine was a state. This is as mainstream an argument as it gets. But there is something weird about considering Israel a secessionist movement. Usually, secessionist movements aren't recognized by the international community. There's a reason why Somaliland is only recognized by Ethiopia. it's considered unfriendly towards the host state, in this case Somalia, to do so. But since Palestinian statehood is so questioned from the get-go, and since Palestinian lives are so dehumanized to begin with, this is not the case with Palestine. Many states recognized Israel regardless of whether Palestine agreed. And this is key. Palestine needs to agree. A secessionist claim to territory is only consolidated after the host state agrees. This is the relevance of Palestine's declaration of independence in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The mainstream view sees this process as the process through which Israel will allow the creation of the Palestinian state. I see it as the process through which Palestine, as an already existing state, will grant ultimate legitimacy to Israel's secession by agreeing to renounce to its Uti Possidetis right to all of mandatory Palestine in order to recognize two states: Israel, the secessionist state, and Palestine, the state from which Israel seceded from. So there you have it. Palestine is a state because it has been so for over 100 years. The question I would like to pose now, though, is perhaps the more radical. Does this matter at all? Do we really think identifying two states, Palestine and Israel, will actually change conditions on the ground for Palestinians? Or is it that Palestine, as an orientalized, securitized, colonized, non-Western state, will never be fully accepted into the community of nations? Let's imagine for a second that the two-state solution is realized. What would that look like? Under current realities, most likely it would be a demilitarized state subjected to Israeli security control on grounds of national security. You see, so-called common, or rather Western wisdom, conceives Palestine as a nation full of potential terrorists. So, Israel, goes the logic, needs to be able to maintain security control to contain these threats until such time as the new, quote-unquote, Palestinian state is able to manage security on its own. Sound familiar? Sure it does. It's another mandate, this time with Israel as the mandatory state. This kind of burdened statehood is, according to Adam Getachew, typical of instances where non-Western communities make a claim to sovereignty. In her excellent World Making After Empire, Getachew explains this through the case of Ethiopia's inclusion into the League of Nations, not as a mandate, but as an independent state. She shows how this idea of non-Western sovereignty created important discomforts in the European core. The mandate system, after all, was premised on the fact that non-Western peoples could not, quote, develop themselves and needed white people to show them how. So how could Ethiopia make this claim to unsupervised sovereignty? The response was essentially hypocrisy. Ethiopia was formally included in the League, but it was never seen as an equal. Western states were quick to point out that in some parts of Ethiopia, local communities still practice slavery. If Ethiopia wanted to be a full member of the League, it needed to show that it could bring this practice to an end. And of course, nothing Ethiopia did was enough. Eventually, it was placed under the supervision of the League. Black sovereignty couldn't just be, it had to be burdened. This was a particularly absurd situation given the recent experience with forced labor in the Congo Free State and semi-feudal Pongaje in Latin America. These never led to sovereignty being questioned since they were white-ruled. Essentially, Ethiopia had to show the League that it was ready for membership and self-determination. Dina Tuvala sees in these dynamics the expression of the standard of civilization, hidden through the discourse of international law. This is a discourse, she argues, that actually never went away. Well, in the early 20th century, Ethiopia had to prove that it could combat slavery to be included. In the 2000s, Middle Eastern states need to prove that they can combat terrorism through the logic of the US's war on terror. That is, they need to engage in the logic of US capitalism as a de-radicalizing force. Or they will be invaded and droned. Non-Western sovereignty continues to be burdened. It is this kind of burdened sovereignty that the two-state solution offers the purported Palestinian state on pre-1967 borders. This Palestinian state would need to demonstrate to the world that it can be a good capitalist country, the quote-unquote Singapore of the Middle East, as some say for Gaza, before it can gain the right not to be bombed, raided, and checkpointed by Israel. And of course, since this is deployed under the logic of the standard of civilization, Israel and the US will simply never think that the Palestinian state of the two-state solution is done civilizing and de-radicalizing. Like Ethiopia in the League, which ended up invaded by fascist Italy, this Palestine will end up subjugated to Israel. Just like Oslo before it, the two-state solution simply becomes another element of control, not emancipation and liberation. So, if not two states, then what? I want to start off by saying that it is not really my place to tell Palestinians how they should conceive of their own liberation. That said, if I'm asked, I would agree with those Palestinians that advocate not for two, but one state in Israel-Palestine. Instead of a nation-state for Palestinians and a nation-state for Jews, this single state would eliminate ethnicity and/or religion as the basis for its existence. Every person living in Israel-Palestine, regardless of their identity, would be an equal citizen with equal rights to self-determination. The nation so constructed of this nation-state would be, by definition, multi-ethnic and diverse, which is honestly where the modern state is trending either way, away from ethno-nationalist conceptions. But, I hear you say, where would the national home of Jewish people be? Well, in Israel-Palestine. Just like Belgium is the national home for both Walloons and Flemish people, or like Peru is the national home for Quechuas and Aymaras and its white population, Israel-Palestine can be the national home of Jewish, Palestinians, Druze, Berber, etc. The idea that democracy should somehow lead to a so-called demographic threat is steeped in racism. Israel does not need to be a state that excludes non-Jews from its definition of nationhood to be a place where Jews can live with full self-determination and human rights. On the contrary, I'd argue it is the insistence of tying Jewishness to a settler colonial project in the Middle East that makes Israelis unsafe by forcing them to live in a state of perpetual war for 7 decades. It is perfectly possible to build a state with constitutional and international arrangements in place that protect the rights of all of its inhabitants, regardless of ethnicity or religion. In fact, it is this kind of disassembling of the nation-state, of communities that exist through the erasure of the proverbial lines in the sand, not their reinforcing, that will be the future of the post-colonial world. Think of Latin America, for instance. Latin America has long been composed of fractured societies. You could say that just like Israel in Palestine, many Latin societies display their own kind of apartheid against indigenous people. These indigenous communities have spent decades fighting for self-determination, and their main proposal has consistently been the abandonment of the nation-state and the creation of plurinational states. In other words, these communities see the modern nation-state as the colonial institution that constructs an idea of nation that excludes those who do not embrace or assimilate to a fundamentally Western or Westernized identity. Thus, they are the minority in need of protection through human rights, as opposed to the constituent pillars of the state they inhabit. Plurinationality, therefore, seeks to abandon the minority rights paradigm and grant indigenous peoples full representation and participation in state and government affairs, particularly for natural resources in their land. There's much more to say about plurinationality. I am planning a video essay on it, in fact. But for now, suffice to say, this call to end social apartheid and reconceive society is not on the basis of those who are in the nation-state and those who are minorities outside of the nation, is a key aspect of the modern decolonial movement. For more on that, check this video where I talked about it in the past. In similar fashion, instead of needing a Jewish state for a Jewish nation that excludes non-Jews and relegates them to second-level status or worse, apartheid, an Israeli-Palestinian plural nation where these ethnic identities are not tied to the enjoyment of rights seems to be more forward-looking and frankly workable. Instead of a racist viewpoint where certain peoples and cultures are inferior, plurinational approaches rather posit that coexistence would remove much of the rationale for violence as a vehicle for self-determination. It is, after all, what happened in Ireland. The best way to solve the conflict between Catholics and Protestants was to erase the line that separated the Catholic land from the Protestant land and rather embrace a plural definition of Irish, one where Catholics can be Catholic and Protestants can be Protestant regardless of their geographical location. In the same way, removing the lines that separate the secessionist entity, Israel, from the host state, Palestine, and creating a single state where everyone can be whatever they want to be, wherever they want, seems like a much more workable objective than two states joined by an Orientalist and colonial international dynamic. Thus, self-determination, not ethnic nationalism, would be the principle that governs statehood. So let me know if you have any questions and comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. So thanks for watching.